Chapter 4 of The World Set Free by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marsatich. June 2009, Alexandria, Virginia. The World Set Free by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 4th. The New Phase. Section 9. The early years of the World Republic witnessed a certain recrudescence of political adventure. There was, it is rather curious to note, no revival of separatism after the face of King Ferdinand Charles had vanished from the sight of men. But in a number of countries, as the first urgent physical needs were met, there appeared a variety of personalities having this in common, that they sought to revive political trouble and clamber by its aid to positions of importance and satisfaction. In no case did they speak in the name of kings, and it is clear that monarchy must have been far gone in obsolescence before the 20th century began. But they made appeals to the large survivals of nationalist and racial feeling that were everywhere to be found. They alleged with considerable justice that the Council was overriding racial and national customs and disregarding religious rules. The great plain of India was particularly prolific in such agitators. The revival of newspapers, which had largely ceased during the terrible year because of the dislocation of the coinage, gave a vehicle and a method of organization to these complaints. At first, the Council disregarded this developing opposition, and then it recognized it with an entirely devastating frankness. Never, of course, had there been so provisional a government. It was of an extravagant illegality. It was, indeed, hardly more than a club of about 100 persons. At the outset there were 93, and these were increased afterwards by the issue of invitations which more than balanced its deaths, to as many at one time as 119. Always its constitution had been miscellaneous. At no time were these invitations issued with an admission that they recognized a right. The old institution or monarchy had come out unexpectedly well in the light of the new regime. 9 of the original members of the first government were crowned heads who had resigned their separate sovereignty, and in no time afterwards did the number of its royal members sink below 6. In their case there was perhaps a kind of attenuated claim to rule, but except for them and the still more infinitesimal pretensions of 1 or 2 ex-presidents of republics, no member of the Council had even the shade of a right to his participation in its power. It was natural, therefore, that its opponents should find a common ground in a clamor for representative government, and build high hopes upon a return to parliamentary institutions. The Council decided to give them everything they wanted, but in a form that suited ill with their aspirations. It became at one stroke a representative body. It became, indeed, magnificently representative. It became so representative that the politicians were drowned in a deluge of votes. Every adult of either sex, from pole to pole, was given a vote, and the world was divided into 10 constituencies, which voted on the same day by means of a simple modification of the world post. Membership of the government, it was decided, must be for life, save in the exceptional case of a recall. But the elections, which were held quinquennially, were arranged to add 50 members on each occasion. The method of proportional representation with 1 transferable vote was adopted, and the voter might also write upon his voting paper, in a specially marked space, the name of any of his representatives that he wished to recall. A ruler was recallable by as many votes as the quota by which he had been elected, and the original members by as many votes in any constituency as the returning quotas in the first election. Upon these conditions the Council submitted itself very cheerfully to the suffrages of the world. None of its members were recalled, and its 50 new associates, which included 27 which it had seen fit to recommend, were of an altogether too miscellaneous quality to disturb the broad trend of its policy. Its freedom from rules or formalities prevented any obstructive proceedings, and when one of the two newly arrived Home Rule members for India sought for information how to bring in a bill, they learnt simply that bills were not brought in. They asked for the Speaker, and were privileged to hear much ripe wisdom from the ex-King Egbert, who was now consciously among the seniors of the gathering. Thereafter they were baffled men. But already, by that time, the work of the Council was drawing to an end. It was concerned not so much for the continuation of its construction, as for the preservation of its accomplished work from the dramatic instincts of the politician. The life of the race becomes indeed more and more independent of the formal government. The Council, in its opening phase, was heroic in spirit, a dragon-slaying body. It slashed out of the existence a vast knotted tangle of obsolete ideas and clumsy jealous proprietorships. It secured by a noble system of institutional precautions, freedom of inquiry, freedom of criticism, free communications, a common basis of education and understanding, and freedom from economic oppression. With that its creative task was accomplished. It became more and more an established security, and less an active intervention. There is nothing in our time to correspond with the continual petty making and entangling of laws in an atmosphere of contention that is perhaps the most perplexing aspect of constitutional history in the 19th century. In that age they seem to have been perpetually making laws when we should alter regulations. The work of change which we delegate to these scientific committees of specific general direction, which have the special knowledge needed, and which are themselves dominated by the broad intellectual process of the community, was in those days inextricably mixed up with legislation. They fought over the details. We should as soon think of fighting over the arrangement of the parts of a machine. We know nowadays that such things go on best within laws, as life goes on between earth and sky. And so it is that government gathers now for a day or so each year under the sunshine of Brissago, when St. Bruno's lilies are in flower, and does little more than bless the work of its committees. And even these committees are less originative and more expressive of the general thought than they were at first. It becomes difficult to mark out the particular directive personalities of the world. Continually we are less personal. Every good thought contributes now, and every able brain falls within that informal and dispersed kingship which gathers together into one purpose the energies of the race. Section 10. It is doubtful if we shall ever see again the phase of human existence in which politics, that is to say, a partisan interference with the ruling sanities of the world, will be the dominant interest among serious men. We seem to have entered upon an entirely new phase in history, in which contention, as distinguished from rivalry, has almost abruptly ceased to be the usual occupation, and is become at most a subdued and hidden and discredited thing. Contentious professions cease to be an honorable employment for men. The peace between nations is also a peace between individuals. We live in a world that comes of age. Man the warrior, man the lawyer, and all the bickering aspects of life pass into obscurity. The grave dreamers, man the curious learner, and man the creative artist come forward to replace these barbaric aspects of existence by a less ignoble adventure. There is no natural life of man. He is, and has always been, a sheath of varied and even incompatible possibilities, a palimpsest of inherited dispositions. It was the habit of many writers in the early 20th century to speak of competition and the narrow, private life of trade and saving and suspicious isolation, as though such things were in some exceptional way proper to the human constitution, and as though openness of mind and a preference for achievement over possession were abnormal and rather unsubstantial qualities. How wrong that was the history of the decades immediately following the establishment of the World Republic witnesses. Once the world was released from the hardening insecurities of a needless struggle for life that was collectively planless and individually absorbing, it became apparent that there was in the vast mass of people a long smothered passion to make things. The world broke out into making, and at first mainly into aesthetic making. This phase of history, which has been not inaptly termed the efflorescence, is still, to a large extent, with us. The majority of our population consists of artists, and the bulk of activity in the world lies no longer with necessities, but with their elaboration, decoration, and refinement. There has been an evident change in the quality of this making during recent years. It becomes more purposeful than it was, losing something of its first elegance and prettiness, and gaining in intensity. But that is a change rather of hue than of nature. That comes with a deepening philosophy and a sounder education. For the first joyous exercises of fancy we perceive now the deliberation of a more constructive imagination. There is a natural order in these things, and art comes before science, as the satisfaction of more elemental needs come before art, and as play and pleasure come in a human life before the development of a settled purpose. For thousands of years this gathering impulse to creative work must have struggled in man against the limitations imposed upon him by his social ineptitude. It was a long smoldering fire that flamed out at last in all these things. The evidence of a pathetic, perpetually thwarted urgency to make something is one of the most touching aspects of the relics and records of our immediate ancestors. There exists still in the death area about the London bombs a region of deserted small homes that furnish the most illuminating comment on the old state of affairs. These homes are entirely horrible, uniform, square, squat, hideously proportioned, uncomfortable, dingy, and in some respects quite filthy. Only people in complete disrepair of anything better could have lived in them. But to each is attracted a ridiculous little rectangle of land called the garden, containing usually a prop for drying clothes and a loathsome box of offal, the dustbin, full of eggshells, cinders, and such like refuse. Now that one may go about this region in comparative security, for the London radiations have dwindled to inconsiderable proportions, it is possible to trace in nearly every one of these gardens some effort to make. Here it is a poor little plank summer-house, here it is a fountain of bricks and oyster shells, here a rockery, here a workshop, and in the houses everywhere there are pitiful little decorations, clumsy models, feeble drawings. These efforts are almost incredibly inept, like the drawings of blindfolded men. They are only one shade less harrowing to a sympathetic observer than the scribblings one finds upon the walls of the old prisons, but there they are, witnessing to the poor buried instincts that struggled up towards the light. The God of joyous expression our poor fathers ignorantly sought, our freedom has declared to us. In the old days the common ambition of every simple soul was to possess a little property, a patch of land, a house uncontrolled by others, and independence, as the English used to put it. And what made this desire for freedom and prosperity so strong was very evidently the dream of self-expression, of doing something with it, of playing with it, of making a personal delightfulness, a distinctiveness. Property was never more than a means to an end, nor avarice more than a perversion. Men owned in order to do freely. Now that every one of us has his own apartments and his own privacy secure, this disposition to own has found its release in a new direction. Men study and save and strive that they may leave behind them a series of panels in some public arcade, a row of carven figures along a terrace, a grove, a pavilion. Or they give themselves to the penetration of some still opaque riddle in phenomena, as once men gave themselves to the accumulation of riches. The work that was once the whole substance of social existence, for most men spent all their lives in earning a living, is now no more than was the burden upon one of those old climbers who carried knapsacks of provisions on their backs, in order that they might ascend mountains. It matters little to the easy charities of our emancipated time that most people who have made their labor contribution produce neither new beauty nor new wisdom, but are simply about those pleasant activities and enjoyments that reassure them that they are alive. They help, it may be, by reception and reverberation, and they hinder nothing. Section 11. Now, all this phase of gigantic change in the contours and appearances of human life which is going on all about us, a change as rapid and as wonderful as the swift ripening of adolescence to manhood after the barbaric boyish years, is correlated with moral and mental changes at least as unprecedented. It is not as if old things were going out of life and new things coming in. It is rather that the altered circumstances of men are making an appeal to elements in his nature that have hitherto been suppressed, and checking tendencies that have hitherto been overstimulated and overdeveloped. He has not so much grown and altered his essential being, as turned new aspects to the light. Such turnings round into a new attitude the world has seen on a less extensive scale before. The Highlanders of the 17th century, for example, were cruel and bloodthirsty robbers. In the 19th, their descendants were conspicuously trusty and honorable men. There was not a people in Western Europe in the early 20th century that seemed capable of hideous massacres, and none that had not been guilty of them within the previous 2 centuries. The free, frank, kindly, gentle life of the prosperous classes in any European country before the years of the last wars was in a different world of thought and feeling from that of the dingy, suspicious, secretive, and uncharitable existence of the respectable poor, or of the constant personal violence, the squalor and naive passions of the lowest stratum. Yet there were no differences of blood and inherent quality between these worlds. Their differences were all in circumstances, suggestion, and habits of mind. And turning to more individual instances, the constantly observed difference between one portion of a life and another consequent upon a religious conversion were a standing example of the versatile possibilities of human nature. The catastrophe of the atomic bombs, which shook men out of cities and businesses and economic relations, shook them also out of their old established habits of thought, and out of the lightly held beliefs and prejudices that came down to them from the past. To borrow a word from the old-fashioned chemists, men were made nascent, they were released from old ties. For good or evil, they were ready for new associations. The council carried them forward for good. Perhaps if his bombs had reached their destination, King Ferdinand Charles might have carried them back to an endless chain of evils. But his task would have been a harder one than the council's. The moral shock of the atomic bombs had been a profound one, and for a while the cunning side of the human animal was overpowered by its sincere realization of the vital necessity for reconstruction. The litigious and trading spirits cowered together, scared at their own consequences. Men thought twice before they sought mean advantages in the face of the unusual eagerness to realize new aspirations. And when at last the weeds revived again and claims began to sprout, they sprouted upon the stony soil of law courts reformed, of laws that pointed to the future instead of the past, and under the blazing sunshine of a transforming world. A new literature, a new interpretation of history, were springing into existence. A new teaching was already in the schools, a new faith in the young. The worthy man who forestalled the building of a research city for the English upon the Sussex Downs by buying up a series of estates, was dispossessed and laughed out of court when he made his demand for some preposterous compensation. The owner of the discredited Das patents makes his last appearance upon the scroll of history as the insolvent proprietor of a paper called the Cry for Justice, in which he duns the world for £100,000,000. That was the ingenious Das's idea of justice, that he ought to be paid about £5,000,000 annually because he had annexed the salvage of one of Holsten's discoveries. Das came at last to believe quite firmly in his right, and he died a victim of conspiracy mania in a private hospital at Nice. Both of these men would probably have ended their days enormously wealthy, and of course ennobled in the England of the opening 20th century, and it is just this novelty of their fates that marks the quality of the new age. The new government early discovered the need of a universal education, to fit men to the great conceptions of its universal rule. It made no wrangling attacks on the local, racial, and sectarian forms of religious profession that at the time divided the earth into a patchwork of hatreds and distrusts. It left these organizations to make their peace with God in their own time. But it proclaimed, as if it were a mere secular truth, that sacrifice was expected from all, that respect had to be shown to all. It revived schools or set them up afresh all around the world, and everywhere these schools taught the history of war and the consequences and moral of the last war. Everywhere it was taught not as a sentiment, but as a matter of fact, that the salvation of the world from waste and contention was the common duty and occupation of all men and women. These things, which are now the elementary commonplaces of human intercourse, seemed to the counsellors of Brissago, when first they dared to proclaim them, marvellously daring discoveries, not untouched by doubt, that flushed the cheek and fired the eye. The council placed all this educational reconstruction in the hands of a committee of men and women, which did its work during the next few decades with remarkable breadth and effectiveness. The Educational Committee was, and is, the correlative upon the mental and spiritual side of the Redistribution Committee, and prominent upon it, and indeed for a time quite dominating it, was a Russian named Karenin, who was singular in being a congenital cripple. His body was bent so that he walked with difficulty, suffered much pain as he grew older, and had at last to undergo 2 operations. The second killed him. Already malformation, which was to be seen in every crowd during the Middle Ages, so that the crippled beggar was, as it were, an essential feature of the human spectacle, was becoming a strange thing in the New World. It had a curious effect upon Karenin's colleagues. Their feeling towards him was mingled with pity and a sense of inhumanity that it needed usage rather than reason to overcome. He had a strong face, with little bright brown eyes rather deeply sunken, and a large resolute thin-lipped mouth. His skin was very yellow and wrinkled, his hair iron gray. He was at all times an impatient and sometimes an angry man, but this was forgiven him because of the hot wire of suffering that was manifestly thrust through his being. At the end of his life his personal prestige was very great. To him far more than any contemporary it is due, that self-abnegation, self-identification with the spirit world, was made the basis of universal education. That general memorandum to the teachers which is the keynote of the modern educational system, was probably entirely his work. "Whosoever should save his soul should lose it," he wrote. That is the device upon the seal of this document, and the starting point of all we have to do. It is a mistake to regard it as anything but a plain statement of fact. It is the basis for your work. You have to teach self-forgetfulness, and everything else that you have to teach is contributory and subordinate to that end. Education is the release of man from self. You have to widen the horizons of your children, encourage and intensify their curiosity and their creative impulses, and cultivate and enlarge their sympathies. That is what you are for. Under your guidance, and the suggestions you will bring to bear on them, you have to shed the old Adam of instinctive suspicions, hostilities, and passions, and to find themselves again in the great being of the universe. The little circles of their egotisms have to be opened out until they become arcs in the sweep of the racial purpose. And this that you teach to others you must learn also sedulously yourselves. Philosophy, discovery, art, every sort of skill, every sort of service, love. These are the means of salvation from that narrow loneliness of desire, that brooding preoccupation with self and egotistical relationships, which is hell for the individual, treason to the race, and exile from God. Section 12. As things round themselves off and accomplish themselves, one begins for the first time to see them clearly. From the perspectives of a new age one can look back upon the great and widening stream of literature with a complete understanding. Things link up that seem disconnected, and things that were once condemned as harsh and aimless are seen to be but factors in the statement of a gigantic problem. An enormous bulk of the sincerer writing of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries falls together now in an unanticipated unanimity. One sees it as a huge tissue of variations upon one theme, the conflict of human egotism and personal passion and narrow imaginations on the one hand, against the growing sense of wider necessities and a possible, more spacious life. That conflict is in evidence in so nearly a work as Voltaire's Candide, for example, in which the desire for justice as well as happiness beats against human contrariety, and takes refuge at last in a forced and inconclusive contentment with little things. Candide was but one of the pioneers of a literature of uneasy complaint that was presently an innumerable multitude of books. The novels more particularly of the 19th century, if one excludes the mere storytellers from our consideration, witness to this uneasy realization of changes that call for effort and the lack of that effort. In a thousand aspects, now tragically, now comically, now with a funny affectation of divine detachment, a countless host of witnesses tell their story of lives fretting between dreams and limitations. Now one laughs, now one weeps, Now one reads with a blank astonishment at this huge and almost unpremeditated record of how the growing human spirit, now warily, now eagerly, now furiously, and always, as it seems, unsuccessfully, tried to adapt itself to the maddening misfit of its patched and ancient garments. And always in these books, as one draws nearer to the heart of the matter, there comes a disconcerting evasion. It was the fantastic convention of the time that a writer should not touch upon religion. To do so was to rouse the jealous fury of the great multitude of professional religious teachers. It was permitted to state the discord, but it was forbidden to glance at any possible reconciliation. Religion was the privilege of the pulpit. It was not only from the novels that religion was omitted. It was ignored by the newspapers. It was pedantically disregarded in the discussion of business questions. It played a trivial and apologetic part in public affairs. And this was done not out of contempt, but respect. The hold of the old religious organizations upon men's respect was still enormous, so enormous that there seemed to be a quality of irreverence in applying religion to the developments of every day. This strange suspension of religion lasted over into the beginnings of the New Age. It was a clear vision of Marcus Karenin, much more than any other contemporary influence, which brought it back into the texture of human life. He saw religion without hallucinations, without superstitious reverence, as a common thing necessary as food and air, as land and energy to the life of man and the well-being of the Republic. He saw that indeed it had already percolated away from the temples and hierarchies and symbols in which men had sought to imprison it, and that it was already at work anonymously and obscurely in the universal acceptance of the greater state. He gave it clearer expression, rephrased it to the lights and perspectives of the new dawn. But if we return to our novels for our evidence of the spirit of the times, it becomes evident as one reads them in their chronological order, so far as that is now ascertainable, that as one comes to the latter 19th and the earlier 20th century, the writers are much more acutely aware of secular change than their predecessors were. The earlier novelists tried to show life as it is. The latter showed life as it changes. More and more of their characters are engaged in adaptation to change or suffering from the effects of world changes. And as we come up to the time of the last wars, this newer conception of the everyday life as a reaction to an accelerated development is continually more manifest. Barnet's book, which has served us so well, is frankly a picture of the world coming about like a ship that sails into the wind. Our later novelists give a vast gallery of individual conflicts, in which old habits and customs, limited ideas, ungenerous temperaments, and innate obsessions are pitted against this great opening out of life that has happened to us. They tell us of the feelings of old people who have been wrenched away from familiar surroundings, and how they have had to make peace with uncomfortable comforts and conveniences that are still strange to them. They give us the discord between the opening egotisms of youth and the ill-defined limitations of a changing social life. They tell of the universal struggle of jealousy to capture and cripple our souls, of romantic failures and tragical misconceptions of the trend of the world, of the spirit of adventure, and the urgency of curiosity, and how these serve the universal drift. And all their stories lead in the end either to happiness missed or happiness won, to disaster or salvation. The clearer their vision and the subtler their art, the more certainly do these novels tell of the possibility of salvation for all the world. For any road in life leads to religion for those upon it who will follow it far enough. It would have seemed a strange thing to the men of the former time that it should be an open question, as it is today, whether the world is wholly Christian or not Christian at all. But assuredly we have the Spirit, and as surely have we left many temporary forms behind. Christianity was the first expression of world religion, the first complete repudiation of tribalism and war and disputation. That it fell presently into the ways of more ancient rituals cannot alter that. The common sense of mankind has toiled through 2,000 years of chastening experience to find at last how sound a meaning attaches to the familiar phrases of the Christian faith. The scientific thinker, as he widens out to the moral problems of the collective life, comes inevitably upon the words of Christ, and as inevitably does the Christian, as his thought grows clearer, arrive at the world republic. As for the claims of the sex, as for the use of a name and successions, we live in a time that has shaken itself free from such claims and consistencies. End of chapter 4.